Welcome to the end of the world, or at least what probably felt like it. In the Christian New Testament, death is one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Today, we look at the Great Mortality, also known as the Black Death. It rocked the European world in the mid-14th century, and it remains the worst epidemic in recorded human history. In just 6 years, plague killed about half of Europe's population. Borrowing from Charles Dickens, it was definitely not the best of times, although it was probably one of the worst. Our story begins in 1346, with, quite possibly, the first recorded instance of biological warfare. The Mongols wanted to capture the Italian city of Kaffa. Their army recognized that disease was killing many of their soldiers. So, they took the bodies of the dead and catapulted them into the city. Plague then spread to the west, via rats that boarded ships. 1 year later, in 1347, we have the first reports of mass death in Europe. The Great Mortality had arrived. It spread along the major trade routes, especially highways. And this, the first wave of plague, lasted until 1353. But what is plague? The answer is Yersinia pestis. It's a blood-borne bacterium. In order to infect humans, it first needs an insect vector. And the insect vector for plague is fleas. There are two theories about how this works. The first theory notes that Yersinia pestis often blocks a flea's stomach. In the process, the flea's lifespan is shortened to about 4 days. Its last days are spent in a kind of failed feeding frenzy. When an infected flea bites its host, it sucks blood, but with its stomach blocked, it never feels full. So, infected fleas keep biting their hosts, wanting to satisfy their hunger. This increases the likelihood of transmission. Yersinia pestis then spreads from the flea vector to the human host. The second theory is called early phase transmission, or EPT for short. It holds that transmission occurs before blockage. But EPT has also noted that the stomachs of some flea species don't get blocked. And those species can live infected with Yersinia pestis for more than a year. Both theories remain in play in modern scientific research. Okay, so maybe that was uncomfortable. It gets more interesting though. Infection is part of a chain of transmission, and a chain of transmission requires several things. In addition to an infected flea, we need a flea species that will also feed on humans. But before the flea feeds on humans, it feeds on some sort of animal. So, we need a flea that fed on one or more of the animals that lived among 14th century Europeans. And these requirements rapidly narrow the range of possibility. It is now recognized that the flea vector was probably Xenocilla chaopus, and the black rat, scientific name Rattus rattus, was the host before the infected fleas infected humans. Let's now talk about symptoms. Eyewitness accounts were remarkably consistent, and we have similar stories from the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire, and Western Europe. The most common symptom was the appearance of boils on the body. The boils were called buboes. This is where the term bubonic plague comes from. They were swollen lymph nodes. If you didn't die within a few days, your buboes would probably burst. But bubonic plague is also called the Black Death. One possible symptom of plague is the bursting of blood vessels beneath the skin. When blood dries, it often turns a deep red or black color, and the resulting rash look the same. The Great Mortality spurred many economic changes. In the words of one contemporary, those who were accustomed to have plenty fell into need. Those accustomed to suffer want experienced abundance. Some historians believe that these were the greatest economic changes of the previous 1,000 years. For example, in the century after the Great Mortality, wages increased by more than 100%. Another important change was a massive redistribution of property. With almost half the population dead, huge amounts of land were left with no owners. Because laborers were now in short supply, property owners had fewer people to lease their land to for farming. So, needing money, they sold their land instead. However, in time, there was so much land for sale that the price of land dropped considerably. This is basic supply and demand. When supply grows faster than demand, prices decrease. But even those who could not afford to buy land still found themselves better off. Some historians have even described this period as the golden age of labor. Laborers can now expect a higher income for their work. After all, with fewer people to work the land, labor was now more valuable. The magnitude of plague appears in many sources from the time period. Consider this description, which comes from the Arab historian and mapmaker Ibn al-Wardi. He wrote, "There the plague sat, like a king on a throne and swayed with power, killing daily 1,000 or more and decimating the population." As you might imagine, one response to disease was despair. We see some of this in the popular work Piers Plowman by the English author William Langland. He wrote, "God is deaf nowadays and will not hear us. And for our guilt, he grinds good men to dust." Plague may have also had an afterlife in the children's rhyme Ring Around the Rosie. Some historians believe that it originated in the time of plague. Norman Cantor is one such historian. The ring in the poem refers to boils. The posies refer to flowers that were carried to ward off plague. One theory at the time was that good smells counteracted polluted air. But the rhyme ends with "ashes, ashes, we all fall down," and that refers to plague killing so many. However, other historians dispute this. The oldest written evidence for Ring Around the Rosie actually comes from the 19th century. So, it's a matter of debate, but it's also a possibility worth keeping in mind. One of the more disturbing responses to plague was the Flagellant movement. Here we see the remarkable portrayal of the Flagellants in the 1957 film, The Seventh Seal. Flagellants traveled from town to town, literally whipping themselves. They called for repentance because, like most people, they believed that plague was a punishment from God. The men were shirtless, so onlookers could see the blood and the scars on their bodies. Interestingly, flagellant membership was extremely short-term. You were only allowed to join for 33.5 days. This symbolized the number of years that Jesus had lived. And you weren't allowed to beat yourself to death either. So, however sincere their beliefs might have been, there was also a good bit of theater involved. But the Flagellants were condemned by the papacy and disappeared around the year 1350. You could watch The Seventh Seal and interpret it as an allegory for life in Europe after the Second World War. The Seventh Seal features a very young Max von Sydow as its protagonist, a knight who has just returned to Europe from crusading abroad. As the film opens, he is greeted by death, and this becomes the first instance of a recurring theme. Every time death reappears, their chess game continues. And then, spoiler alert, death ultimately wins. I don't recommend taking your knowledge of history from movies, but as an imaginative exercise, film is sometimes very helpful, and The Seventh Seal is brilliant. It's one of my all-time favorite films, and it showcases how remarkable and moving black and white film can still be. And it doesn't hurt that the story is top-notch. So what? Let me introduce a key term: longue durée. It's French for a long time or an extended period. It's one of the ways that historians talk about continuity in history. The longue durée of the Great Mortality lasted well over a century. This picture comes from a Bible more than 60 years after the plague first hit. It's an illustration from the book of Exodus. It shows the boils sent by God against the Egyptians. But it also shows the suffering of plague, which appears like buboes on the body. By the end of the 15th century, older memories of plague had become cultural commonplaces. Here is the Danse Macabre, which is French for the Dance of Death. This picture comes from the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493. As one skeleton plays an instrument, the other skeletons dance. On the right-hand side, we see intestines, and the buried skeleton has worms. Here, death is an unbridled mockery of life. Although memories can become commonplaces, they can also become new sources of inspiration. In the early 1520s, as Hans Holbein illustrated The Dance of Death, he used familiar portrayals of death to encourage deep reflection on life. Death may come at any time, and it may come for anyone. Holbein wanted readers of the book and viewers of its illustrations to ask themselves, what kind of life am I living today? In Holbein's Christian context, this raised questions about judgment and the afterlife. But all of this also gave rise to yet another longue durée, and that brings us to a key phrase, memento mori. It's Latin for remember your death. It became a popular subject in Renaissance art and beyond. In fact, people still use the phrase memento mori. It's good, it's heavy, it's existential advice, and an exhortation to live virtuously. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First is The Black Death, The Great Mortality of 1348 to 1350, A Brief History with Documents. It's a collection of sources, including eyewitness accounts, edited by John Aberth. Aberth is probably the world's leading English-language scholar of medieval plague. And he also authored our second book. Its title is similar, The Black Death, A New History of the Great Mortality, 1347 to 1500. It's not a collection of sources, but a synthesis of research. Published in 2020, it's the most up-to-date overview currently available. Finally, if you're interested in the Seventh Seal, look into Melvyn Bragg's short book, The Seventh Seal, which is part of a series by the British Film Institute. Bragg offers insights into both Bergman and his most famous film. The Seventh Seal also has its own afterlife. So, here is some recommended listening. In 1969, the American musician Scott Walker released the album Scott 4. It opens with a song entitled The Seventh Seal. It covers the major themes and plot developments of the film. It's a powerful ballad and a good reminder that the world of plague still intersects our own. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.